This is the driving force that basically causes the acceleration of chronic disease, whether it be obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, or even Alzheimer's. These are diseases which are all driven by inflammation. Second of all, they control your brain. If there's one organ in your body that you really want to protect, it's your brain, especially as you age. And eicosanoids are critically important for controlling brain function. They control your heart. Every heart medication we have ultimately tries to change the levels of eicosanoids, including the #1 drug we have to prevent a heart attack, which is basically still remains an aspirin. And finally, they control your immune system. So here you have four very important reasons why you want to basically understand and, more importantly, be able to manipulate eicosanoids, because they control inflammation, your brain, your heart, and your immune system. So what really are these eicosanoids? If this was a biotechnology conference, I'd be describing them as biological response modifiers. Well, what does that mean in real terms? It means they're cellular regulators. They turn cells on and they turn cells off on a second-by-second basis, just like the light switch turns on a room light and can turn it off on a second-by-second basis. But in reality, what they are really super hormones, because eicosanoids were the first hormones ever developed by living organisms 500 million years ago. And as a consequence, they had to do a lot of multitasking, which they still do today. And therefore, every other hormone in your body is either under direct or indirect control of these eicosanoids. So to understand eicosanoids means begin to understand the entire hormonal communication system through our body. Now, if we ask what eicosanoids are, most physicians have never heard of them. However, what they are is a very complex group of hormones, all derived from fatty acids, and particularly C20 fatty acids, which are polyunsaturated.
Barry?
Yes.
I'm going to interrupt you just for a minute. We've had a couple of people type in and say they're having a little bit of trouble hearing you.
Okay.
So I don't know if you can just move the phone a little bit closer to your mouth or speak just a little bit louder. They can hear you, but it's
okay.
we're requesting a little bit more volume.
Okay,
Thank
let's
you.
try this. So if we ask what eicosanoids are, they really fall into many major subgroups. One group is obviously known as prostaglandins, and most physicians have heard of prostaglandins. Another group are known as thromboxanes. These are the eicosanoids that are the driving force for developing heart attacks and clots. There are also leukotrienes. Again, these are eicosanoids which are important in the immune function, but usually are the ones associated with allergies and other immune dysfunctions. There are also hydroxylated fatty acids. These are the fatty acids that basically facilitate metastases of cancer cells. There's another group known as endocannabinoids. These are hormones basically that make you hungry. There's also anti-inflammatory eicosanoids like lipoxins, or 15-epi-lipoxins, or resolvins. There's a great number of groups all being discovered on a yearly basis that makes this the most exciting area of hormonal research today in medical science. Oops, wrong direction. Now, it's probably best to go back for a little eicosanoid history. Even though eicosanoids were first developed by living organisms some 500 million years ago, our knowledge only started in 1929. And that's when the first experiments were undertaken to take all fats out of the diet. And if you do this, the test animals, in this case rats, would die. They started adding back certain fats, and then the rats would live. Those fats they added back were known as vitamin F. Today we know them as essential fatty acids. In 1936, the first eicosanoid was isolated. In fact, isolated from the prostate gland, hence the word prostaglandin. At that time, it was thought that all hormones had to come from a gland. And it turns out that's not true for eicosanoids because each of your 100 trillion cells can make eicosanoids. So there's no one eicosanoid gland, but really 100 trillion eicosanoid glands. In 1971, we finally understood how the wonder drug of the 20th century, that being aspirin, actually worked. It works by changing the levels and reducing the levels of inflammatory eicosanoids. And the 1982 Nobel Prize in Medicine was awarded for understanding how eicosanoids are the driving force of chronic disease. With all this as a background, coupled with the fact there are more than 120,000 publications on eicosanoids since 1966, it remains an amazing point of almost medical ignorance that virtually no physician really understands these hormones and how they work. There are really three eicosanoid players. I said earlier that all eicosanoids are derived from C20 length carbon atoms, fatty acids, and they have to be polyunsaturated. And there are three. One is called dihomo gamma linolenic acid, or DGLA, and this is the building block of many of your very powerful anti-inflammatory eicosanoids. There's also the fatty acid known as arachidonic acid, or AA, and this is the building block of many powerful pro-inflammatory eicosanoids. And the other fatty acid that can be made into eicosanoids is known as EPA, and this is also a building block of various anti-inflammatory eicosanoids. So you can see, depending on the balance of DGLA or arachidonic acid or EPA, you can either make pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory eicosanoids. And what determines that balance? It's your diet. And if we talk about wellness, which is really the real key of, I believe, 21st century medicine, it requires a balance of eicosanoids.
Hello, Dr. Sears.
Yes.
I hate to interrupt you again, and this information is so important that we're still getting some complaints that we can't hear you well. Now, are you calling in on your microphone or on the telephone?
Microphone. Should I call on the telephone?
Yes, sir. I think that would help. Do you have the number there?
No, give me the number. I'll call in about 1 second. What number should I call?
If you clicked, sorry about the noise around. If you clicked on just below dashboard on your panel, you'd expand the panel first.
Right.
And if you clicked on audio, it's below the dashboard.
Okay, I've got audio, use telephone, right?
Yes, click on use telephone and then the numbers should appear. Are you seeing it? Okay, there you go. There you go. Yeah. Sorry about this, folks. He's getting back on.
David, I'm right here.
Okay, great. You sound a lot better. A lot better.
Well, I guess I couldn't sound any worse.
Okay, folks, type in if he's better now, if you're hearing him okay. Dr. Sears?
Yes, sir.
Okay?
Very good.
All right. Okay, good. Now he's
okay,
great.
very good.
Now he's great.
I'll stick with AT&T on the landline from now on.
Okay. Sorry about the interruption. Okay.
So I do apologize when we go back to our slide one. If we talk about wellness, which is really the major theme of 21st century medicine, it requires a balance of eicosanoids, because we can view eicosanoids as either being good, or bad. Now, there's no such thing as a good eicosanoid or a bad one. These are simply operational terms, like we describe good and bad cholesterol. If you had no bad cholesterol, you would die. It's only when the balance of good and bad cholesterol is out of sync that you're more likely to develop a heart attack. And likewise, we can talk about good and bad eicosanoids. These are simply operational terms that talk about incredibly powerful but opposite physiological functions. As example, of a good eicosanoid inhibits platelet aggregation. Remember, it's platelets aggregating that's the primary cause of heart disease. So a good eicosanoid would inhibit that. On the other hand, a bad eicosanoid promotes it. So you're probably thinking, if I had some magical power to eliminate all bad eicosanoids, you would eliminate heart disease almost overnight. That's true. That's the good news. The bad news is you probably bleed to death the next day because you need a balance of good and bad eicosanoids. But if you have cardiovascular disease, you're making more bad eicosanoids and fewer good ones. Likewise, good eicosanoids are vasodilators. Bad ones are vasoconstrictors. If you have high blood pressure, you're simply making more bad eicosanoids and not enough good ones. Good eicosanoids are anti-inflammatory agents. Bad ones are pro-inflammatory. If you're racked with rheumatoid arthritis, then you are making more bad eicosanoids, not enough good ones. Good eicosanoids control cellular inflammation or cellular proliferation. Bad ones increase it. If you have cancer, you're making more bad eicosanoids, not enough good ones. Good eicosanoids enhance the immune function. Bad ones suppress it. If you're constantly catching infectious disease, you're making more bad eicosanoids and less good ones. I think you see the point here. You need a balance. But my aha moment, personally, was when the 1982 Nobel Prize in Medicine was awarded, because I said, there's the answer. If you could simply induce the body to make more good eicosanoids and fewer bad ones, you basically have cut the Gordian knot of chronic disease. And that led me basically to begin to explore treating food like a drug, to take food to now alter the balance of eicosanoids within the body. Now, of these eicosanoids, especially the good ones, the ones that have probably been most widely studied is one in particular, and this one is known as PGE1. This particular eicosanoid is illustrative of how these hormones have multitasked over hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Like in the cardiovascular system, PGE1 inhibits platelet aggregation, very powerful vasodilator. In the immune system, it has very powerful anti-inflammatory effects. In the central nervous system, it controls the release and uptake of neurotransmitters and has a very profound anti-depressive action. In the endocrine system, it inhibits insulin secretion and also increases the synthesis of cyclic AMP. Digestive system, it reduces acid secretion. In the respiratory system, it relaxes bronchial tissue. The list goes on, but I simply ran out of space on the slides. So you can see that this one particular eicosanoid can do many things across many organ systems. Oftentimes, the one picture is worth 1,000 words, and this is a study that was done in the mid-1980s in which a patient was coming in to be treated for gangrene. And what they did was an angiogram looking at the femoral artery on the left-hand side, and it was highly occluded. And as a consequence, very little oxygen transfer was making its way to the peripheral tissue, and gangrene had set in. Well, how do you basically handle gangrene? The same way they handled it 500 years ago. You cut the leg off. But before they cut the leg off, they said, let's do an experimental procedure. Let's infuse by interarterial cut-down PGE1. The reason why they had to use an interarterial infusion is because the lifetime of these eicosanoids is a one-pass circulatory system. So you can't give it intravenously. But what they did, they basically did a surgical cut down, infused the PG1 in an intraarterial format for 7 days. And you can see on the right-hand side the dramatic increase in the size of the femoral artery. And with that, enough oxygen transfer was done that the patient, basically the leg was saved. Now, let's pretend that you're a cardiovascular patient. Do you want your arteries to look like those on the left or those on the right? Well, let's say you're a stroke victim. Do you want your cerebral arteries to look like those on the left or those on the right? I think the answers would be, I'd like to have my arteries look like those on the right. Well, how? To make more good eicosanoids, which are powerful vasodilators. Now, the reason I said earlier that these eicosanoids, as powerful as they are ultimately controlled by our diet. Because the dietary fat we eat at every meal will contain some essential fatty acids. And whether these essential fatty acids become either good or bad eicosanoids will be determined by the balance of two other hormones controlled in our diet. One is glucagon, coming from the amount of protein at a meal, and the other is insulin, coming from the amount of carbohydrate at a meal. And how these hormones all work together, the essential fatty acids, insulin, and glucagon, is really the story of how to manipulate eicosanoids to make more good ones and less bad ones. We can look at this in a much more detailed format in terms of the metabolism of omega-6 fatty acids. The most common omega-6 fatty acid in our diet is linoleic acid. And this was a fairly minor component in the human food chain until recently being 1920. That's when we learned how to extract vegetable seed oils with gasoline, and with that, there's been a dramatic increase in linoleic acid in the human diet. Because linoleic acid is acted upon by the enzyme delta-6 desaturase, which can be inhibited by both trans fatty acids, but also omega-3 fatty acids like DHA. But depending on how much inhibition, the linoleic acid gets converted to gamma linoleic acid, which is then rapidly converted to dihomo gamma linoleic acid. Well, if life stopped there, it'd be great, because dihomo gamma linoleic acid is the building block of all these powerful anti-inflammatory hormones. Unfortunately, it's also a substrate for the enzyme delta-5 desaturase, which is either inhibited by glucagon and EPA, another omega-3 fatty acid, but can be activated by insulin, and if activated, it converts the dihomo gamma linoleic acid into arachidonic acid. And this becomes your worst hormonal nightmare, because now arachidonic acid is the building block to build a great number of pro-inflammatory eicosanoids, the ones we tend to associate with the rapid development of chronic disease. Now, this is a kind of a summary of the key enzyme, delta-5 desaturase, again, controlled by dietary factors, as most key enzymes in the body are. In particular, the inhibitors of delta-5 desaturase are the omega-3 fatty acid, EPA, and the hormone glucagon, stimulated by the amount of protein at a meal. On the other hand, an activator, a very powerful activator of this enzyme, is insulin. So you can see, as our diet has become greatly enriched in linoleic acid and has become greater amounts of carbohydrates being consumed, which activate and stimulate insulin, we have done everything in our power to make more and more bad eicosanoids and less good ones. And the result being acceleration of chronic disease at an earlier stage in life. And this balance of dihomo gamma-linoleic acid to arachidonic acid is very dynamic, and as shown by this very simple slide, but let's look at the data. This is data published now nearly 20 years ago, that you could take either normal patients or type 2 diabetics and infuse high levels of insulin into the blood for only 6 hours. And after only 6 hours, you see a dramatic conversion of dihomo GLA into arachidonic acid. Now, what happens if you basically maintain high levels of insulin around the clock. Well, you'll be converting more and more of these omega-6 fatty acids into arachidonic acid, and that means greater and greater levels of inflammation in the body. Now, there's no drug known in the medical science that can reduce the production of arachidonic acid. However, there are several drugs that can increase arachidonic acid production. And one of those drugs is the most widely used drug in the world today, and this is called a statin. Statins will have a direct impact. For each percentage point you lower cholesterol, you increase arachidonic acid correspondingly. And this is why some of the major side effects of statins, such as short-term memory loss, can be viewed as a consequence of increasing the levels of arachidonic acid in the brain. This is why cardiologists, they love statins. They lower cholesterol. But this is also why neurologists hate statins, because they raise arachidonic acid. And there are other drugs that can increase the levels of insulin and therefore indirectly increase the levels of arachidonic acid. And these would include diuretics and beta blockers. And then you stand back from the slide and say, wait a minute, aren't these among probably the top 5 drugs recommended to patients? And the answer is yes. It's as if we're basically using drugs to do everything in our power to accelerate the formation of arachidonic acid. Now, obviously diet is one way of reducing this, but of arachidonic acid and the most preferred route. But it's often said that people are more likely to change their religion than to change their diet. So if people are not going to change their diet, and that seems to be a pretty much of a given, what else can we do to simply change the levels of inflammation? Well, this is where high-dose fish oil becomes an important aspect. Why? Because high-dose fish oil will contain these omega-3 fatty acids, in particular EPA. And these fatty acids do 4 things. One, they dilute out excess arachidonic acid. They will not reduce the levels of arachidonic acid in the blood or the cells, but they will dilute it out, making it more difficult to make pro-inflammatory eicosanoids. These omega-3 fatty acids also change gene expression. They change the membrane fluidity, allowing membrane receptors to interact with membranes more effectively and therefore transmit their signals with greater efficiency to the interior of the cell. And they can also change ion channels. So we have something, these omega-3 fatty acids do many, many things over and above basically reducing the inflammatory burden on the body. And you can see in the next picture, when we look at the molecular structure of arachidonic acid or EPA, that they're virtually identical. You have to look very closely to see the differences between these 2 fatty acids. And that's why EPA, if you have enough of it in the diet, can dilute out arachidonic acid by basically being a mimic that can compete for the delta-5 desaturase and therefore basically reduce the production of these inflammatory eicosanoids. Now, we talked about the metabolism of omega-6 fatty acids. The metabolism of omega-3 fatty acids is even more complex. We often hear about saying, well, there's no need to take fish oil, just take lots of flaxseed oil because it's rich in alpha-linoleic acid. That's true, and alpha-linoleic acid can be converted into EPA, but it's a very slow process and not a very efficient process. But we also have to make adequate levels of DHA, and that goes through an even more incredibly complex and slow process, and that can be actually retro-converted back to some more EPA. But here's the bottom line, that the conversion of alpha-linoleic acid into EPA and DHA is incredibly inefficient, which means to get high enough levels of EPA and DHA in the body that one would have to take in massive amounts of alpha-linoleic acid. The best estimates right now is that only about 5 or 10% of alpha-linoleic acid can be converted to EPA, and about 1% or less converted to DHA, which is critical for brain function. So if you're trying to basically use alpha-linolenic acid or flaxseed oil or things of the sort as a source of omega-3 fatty acids, they're simply not basically getting the greatest cluck for the buck in terms of basically controlling inflammation. And why we want to reduce arachidonic acid comes from this very simple diagram. Because if we have arachidonic acid in the cell, and it can be acted upon by the various enzymes that make eicosanoids, whether it be the LOX or COX series of enzymes, we will make either leukotrienes or prostaglandins. And all the anti-inflammatory drugs we have in medicine really work on trying to inhibit the enzymes of this LOX or COX pathways. But in many ways, they are really acting like dumb bombs. That's why they have side effects. A far more elegant, a far more sophisticated approach to change the levels of leukotrienes or prostaglandins is not to inhibit the LOX or COX enzymes, but simply to reduce the levels of the substrate, arachidonic acid. And that is controlled by the diet. So it's going upstream versus downstream. Going downstream, you have collateral damage. You have side effects of drugs. Going upstream is elegant, but it can only be achieved by using the diet, but treating the diet as if it were a drug. Because once you make arachidonic acid, where it goes, nobody knows. And I'm a pretty smart guy, but I can't figure out which enzyme I can, which drug I have to basically inhibit exactly one enzyme to basically inhibit certain eicosanoids. So again, it just makes far more sense to reduce the levels of the substrate to make these inflammatory eicosanoids by reducing the levels of arachidonic acid, or at least diluting them out. Now, if you have pain or chronic disease, here are the usual suspects: PGE2, thromboxane A2, leukotriene B4. Now, the first two are prostaglandins, and that's why drugs like aspirin or non-steroidal anti-inflammatories or COX-2 inhibitors can basically reduce their formation. Do these drugs have some side effects? Yes, they do. But they basically will affect eicosanoids, but they will have absolutely no effect on reducing leukotrienes like leukotriene B4. To do that, you need the final heavy hitter of anti-inflammatory medicine, and these are corticosteroids. These are basically drugs of last resort, but they're the only drugs that can also inhibit leukotrienes at the same time. But basically, when you have chronic disease, basically look at these three as your usual suspects, but they can all be modified by the diet, simply by doing one thing, because they are all derived from arachidonic acid. Reduce the levels of arachidonic acid, you automatically reduce the levels of each of these usual suspects in chronic disease. Now, how much fish oil should you take to help dilute out any excess arachidonic acid? Well, this is not a guessing game. That's why they call it science. What you want to do is look at the ratio of these two fatty acids in the blood. And if it's high, it means you have a lot of inflammation. If it's low, you don't have a lot of inflammation. So what's a good ratio of arachidonic acid to EPA? Well, we can actually find out, ask the question, who are the longest lived people in the world today? And the answer is, that is people who have legitimate birth records, the answer is the Japanese. And they also have the people, or the individuals, who have the longest health span. That is longevity minus years of disability. They also have the lowest rates of depression. And if you look at the Japanese population, their ratio of arachidonic acid to EPA in the blood is between 1.5 and 3. Typically in America, the ratio is about 20. And this explains why the Japanese have far fewer heart attacks than Americans, are far less depressed than Americans, and basically seem to live a better quality of life because they are simply less inflamed. Because the higher the ratio of arachidonic acid to EPA in the blood, the greater the levels of silent inflammation. Now, silent inflammation is inflammation that is below the perception of pain. The correct medical term for it is chronic low-level inflammation. but basically silent information describes it, I think, a lot better. You can't feel it, so you do nothing to stop it. But this type of inflammation that left untreated can basically cause constant organ damage over a long period of time until eventually you call it heart disease, cancer, diabetes, or Alzheimer's. Now, if we look at the consumption of a long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, you see a very different picture. Some populations, like the Eskimos, will consume 7 to 10 grams a day of these long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. The Japanese, today, who are the largest consumers of fish in the world today, consume about 3 grams per day. Our best estimate of what our ancestors ate 10,000 years ago was they were eating also about 3 grams a day of long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. And when your grandparents gave your parents a tablespoon of cod liver oil, which has to be the worst tasting food known to mankind, they were getting about 2.5 grams of omega-3 fatty acids per day. Today, the American or the guidelines from the American Heart Association says, well, maybe 2.5 or 250 milligrams per day should be sufficient, which is a big step forward because the average American consumes only 125 milligrams of long-chain omega-3 fatty acids per day. And that nearly 90% reduction, 90 to 95% reduction, is the reason why our healthcare costs are being driven out of control. Because today Americans are not only the most inflamed people in the world, but they're also the sickest, and that's why we pay so much for healthcare. And not surprisingly, that the ratios of these arachidonic acid, the EPA, in these different populations also reflects the amount of fish oils they consume. The Eskimos have a low ratio. The Japanese about 1.5. Now, in the Mediterranean region, in France, about a decade ago, it was about 9. Today, in the Mediterranean region, it's actually closer to 16. It means in a very short period of time that in the Mediterranean region, the people who are basically eating one of the healthiest diets around basically are becoming more inflamed. Why? Because two things have happened. People are concerned about the contamination of fish. Fish is no longer an inexpensive source of protein, and the world has been flooded with omega-6 fatty acids coming from the heartland of America. That's why today in Italy, that it basically is 5 times more expensive to buy olive oil in Italy than to buy corn oil coming from central Illinois. And that's why, since we are really the major purveyors of omega-6 fatty acids in the world today, the ratio in Americans is about 20, and with people with depression, it's about 23, ADHD, 25, diabetic neuropathy, 30, and I've seen children today who basically have ratios well over 100, which means their likelihood of a long life is basically somewhat highly diminished. So let me give some examples of some of the benefits of high-dose fish oil to dilute out excess arachidonic acid. Again, I emphasize your number one way of reducing inflammation in the body is to reduce arachidonic acid. But this means following an anti-inflammatory diet, and unfortunately, most Americans are reluctant to do so. But what they are more likely to do is to add fish oil. Now, let me give some examples of how this might work. Let's start with obesity. Right there we have one of my patients, Manuel Uribe, who's the fattest man in the world. That was a starting weight of 560 kilograms. And if you don't have a calculator nearby, that's 1,230 pounds. Now, we knew what Manuel's problem was. It wasn't that he was a weak-willed person or that he was morally inferior. He basically was just highly inflamed. Highly inflamed, especially in the brain, where basically if you're making lots of those hormones known as endocannabinoids derived from arachidonic acid, you are hungry all the time. And so we started giving him high-dose fish oil, and there he was about 18 months later, that plus the zone diet. At this point, he's lost about 160 kilograms, and that's about 200 pounds. And as you can see, that he's still morbidly obese. He weighs 880 pounds. But let's look at his blood chemistry. It's perfect. If you looked at his total cholesterol, perfect. HDL cholesterol, great. Triglyceride levels, that you find in world-class athletes. His blood pressure, that of a teenager. His blood sugar, perfect. His resting heart rate, though he hasn't left the bed in 7 years, is that of any trained athlete. His fasting insulin, perfectly normal. And his ratio of arachidonic acid to EPA is now exactly where you want to be, equal to the Japanese population. If any doctor looked at this blood chemistry, they'd say this man is as healthy as a horse. Now, the fact he weighs as much as 2 horses, it basically shows the disconnect between excess body weight and basically a chronic disease. Losing weight, losing fat is a very slow process. Turning around chronic disease induced by inflammation can be very, very rapid, especially with the use of high-dose fish oil. And there's Manuel 30 months later on his wedding night. There's our 2 Mexican physicians, myself in the background, and you can see Manuel's one happy guy. In fact, I was talking to Manuel today just to see how he's doing, and basically he's doing well. So what are the benefits of high-dose fish oil on weight loss? Because this is the #1 question people ask their doctor, saying, how do I lose weight? Well, first of all, to lose weight, it's not basically you have to understand what causes weight gain. What it is, the #1 factor that causes weight gain is inflammation in the adipose tissue. And here's the power of fish oil. Basically, we're really directing an anti-inflammatory drug, the fish oil, the omega-3 fatty acids, to the adipose tissue. That's where basically fats go, to reduce the inflammation. If your fat's on fire, the first thing that's going to happen is you will basically begin to gain weight. The way to lose weight is not to eat less or exercise more, but first, #1 goal you have to do is reduce the inflammation in the adipose tissue, and high-dose fish oil allows you to do that. High-dose fish oil also increases the level of secretion of a hormone from the adipose tissue known as adiponectin. And what adiponectin does, it reduces insulin resistance. It's excess insulin that also makes you fat and keeps you fat. And finally, the high-dose fish oil, it reduces the production of endocannabinoids in the brain. These are the hormones that give you the munchies. So when we're looking for basically new ways to treat our obesity epidemic, we may have it right before our very eyes, the use of high-dose fish oil to alter the hormonal levels that basically are important in controlling inflammation. What about heart disease? This is a study done at Harvard Medical School nearly 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, where they basically took pigs who get atherosclerotic lesions similar to humans, and they fed them an atherosclerotic diet, basically a diet that was rich in saturated fats and rich in refined carbohydrates. You could possibly call it the Krispy Kreme diet. And what they did, they split the pigs into 2 groups. One group got lots of fish oil, and the other group got none. Now, at the end of 6 months of feeding them the Krispy Kreme diet, the cholesterol levels in both sets of pigs were massively elevated, both LDL cholesterol and total cholesterol. And then they killed the pigs to look at the arteries. Those who got the atherosclerotic diet without fish oil, almost total occlusion. And of course, this proves that Krispy Kreme diet will basically kill you. On the other hand, the pigs who got the same Krispy Kreme diet, but with the fish oil, their arteries were almost as clean as a whistle. Why? Because the high dose of fish oil would reduce the inflammation normally caused by the diet, and as a consequence, there was no basically increase in terms of atherosclerotic plaques. Now, that's fine for pigs. What about humans? This is a study published in Lancet about 7 years ago. They took humans who were going in for an aortic resection because the thing that kills humans are called soft, vulnerable plaques. You can't see them. There's no way of looking at them, but they're like little pimples inside the artery. And when they explode due to inflammation, that's the primary cause of cardiac sudden death. So what they did with these patients going in, they split them into 2 groups. One group got corn oil, and the other group got fish oil for a total of about 40 days. And then they did the resection for the aortas, and they can now basically take a look at the soft, vulnerable plaques. Those who were getting the fish oil had much higher levels of EPA and DHA inside the plaque, which means the plaques were very, very dynamic. And those who got the fish oil, they had fewer plaques, they had a very thin, fibrous cap. That means they're very, very prone to rupture. And they also had less macrophages inside the plaques. Where do you find macrophages? Wherever you find inflammation. And so in a very short period of time, 40 days time, that they were able to take patients who basically had a high risk for early sudden cardiac death and reduce the risk dramatically simply by giving them adequate levels of fish oil. And again, if we look at the effect of dilution of arachidonic acid, this is looking at 3 studies. The first 2 were studies done with statins. Statins were not the first drug to lower cholesterol. In fact, they were the 20th drug. The first 19, they'd all lowered cholesterol, but they increased mortality. It's that the statins were the first drug to lower cholesterol that did not increase mortality. Now, it turns out the reason the statins work is not because they are cholesterol-lowering agents. No one understood at the time they also have anti-inflammatory responses. But then we had the JIZZI study, which took patients who already had a heart attack and split them in several groups, and one group was given fish oil. And you can see their reduction of mortality was equivalent to the type of reduction you would expect with a statin. Yet the only side effect known of taking fish oil is that it makes you smarter. Now, here's another study, which was a meta-analysis of all the studies published up to that point of time who would use fish oil or statins, and looking at one very simple endpoint, that endpoint being death, easy to measure. And what you can see is in the studies with fish oil, whether it be all-cause mortality or cardiac mortality, they were equal to, if not superior to statins in reducing mortality. And the take-home lesson from this slide should be, if a doctor is prescribing a statin and not prescribing a fish oil at the same time, they're simply practicing bad medicine. Because one of the side effects of statins is an increase in arachidonic acid. What the fish oil will do is dilute out that increase in arachidonic acid and therefore reduce the side effects of the statins. And we also have data that says if the levels of these omega-3 fatty acids in the blood is greater than 4%, then you see a nearly 70% reduction in fatal heart attacks. No drug can do that, but fish oils can simply by diluting out levels of excess arachidonic acid. And this is a major study published in Japan. Remember, the Japanese are the largest consumers of fish in the world today, and they also had the lowest rates of heart disease. So what they did in this study is they took some 16,000 Japanese who had high cholesterol levels, and both groups got statins to reduce cholesterol. But one group got extra fish oil. And you can see those in the control group who got a placebo, they had a low arachidonic acid EPA level to begin with, but those who got the fish oil plus the statin, they basically saw almost a dropping by a factor of 2. And what you saw over 3.5 years was a further 20% reduction in myocardial events. Again, emphasizing if you're giving a statin to a patient and not giving fish oil at the same time, you are simply practicing bad medicine. And what's like something like cancer, and particularly prostate cancer? It's well known from animal studies that high-dose fish oil can prevent the metastatic spread of prostate cancer. And how they do it is to upregulate a known anti-angiogenic protein. But it requires high levels of omega-3 fatty acids. Now, the person who did the study was at Harvard Medical School, and the animal data was elegant, but he could not get any money from the U.S. government to do it in humans. So I have a foundation, a small foundation, and we gave him some seed money to do the study, and here are the results. that you could look at the prostate cancer, and these are patients who already had determined to have cancerous prostate and were going to be resected out by prostatectomy out within about 45 days. So in that 45-day period, we could either give them corn oil or high-dose omega-3 fatty acids. And you can see on the slides on the left-hand side, when you try to stain for this known anti-angiogenic protein, it simply isn't there. And if you give them corn oil for 45 days and stain again with the resected prostate tumor, there's still no anti-angiogenic protein. But on the other hand, when you basically give them fish oil for 45 days, there's a dramatic increase, a 50-fold increase in this known anti-angiogenic protein, which in animal studies is known to stop the progression of metastatic prostate cancer. This is an interesting study of a patient, data point of one, but an interesting data point of one. He had developed cancer at age 78 and really didn't feel like doing chemotherapy or radiation or surgery. And he said, I just think I'm going to take a lot of fish oil. His doctor said, well, it's your life. So he started taking 15 grams of omega-3 fatty acids per day, starting in July 2004. And here he was 4 years later with about a 93% shrinkage of the tumor, and did the poor man and look at his blood values. Total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, triglycerides, and did he bleed to death? Of course not. His prothrombin time was perfectly normal. And if you go to neurological disorders, let's take something like multiple sclerosis, which is simply known to be inflammation inside the central nervous system. And this is, we have no drugs in medicine that can reverse multiple sclerosis. We have some drugs that might slow it down, but they're not very good drugs. On the other hand, the one drug that they're not very good drugs because they don't pass the blood-brain barrier very well. But there is no blood-brain barrier for omega-3 fatty acids. They can pass it very readily. And this particular study with diagnosed patients with multiple sclerosis, as you reduce their levels of arachidonic acid, EPA, in the blood, what you saw after a 2-year period, that they were getting less disabled. They were getting better. That doesn't happen in multiple sclerosis. You only get worse with time. But here you had a dramatic improvement in their disability index simply by reducing the levels of inflammation both in the blood and in the brain. This is data from Harvard Medical School over a decade ago, treating bipolar depression, the most difficult of all depressions to treat. And they were giving about 10 grams a day of omega-3 fatty acids. And they had to stop the study after 3 months because it became unethical to continue it. Those on the control group were doing so much more poorly than those getting the omega-3 fatty acids. And we also know that the ratio of arachidonic acid to EPA in the blood correlates very strongly with the severity of depression, whether it be the red blood cells or the plasma. But I use this also as an indicator saying when you look at the ratio of arachidonic acid to EPA, it depends on which cell you're looking at in the blood. If you're looking at red blood cells, because they have a lower level of arachidonic acid, you'll get a different number than looking at the plasma that has a higher amount of arachidonic acid. So once you basically decide what you're going to look at, try to stay with that particular standard. I believe the best standard is use the plasma levels, and all of our studies have always looked at the plasma phospholipid levels. This is a study that we published a few years ago in children with ADHD who were already taking their optimal dosage of drugs to control their behavior. And even with that, they still had high levels of arachidonic acid, the EP in the blood, as shown here on the top screen here, average about 23. And once we started giving them high-dose omega-3 fatty acids at about 15 grams per day, within 1 month, you could see a dramatic drop-off in terms of the reduction of the levels. And with that, you'd see a corresponding improvement of their behavior. We can show this on the correlation of the reduction of their severity of their disease with a reduction in terms of the arachidonic acid to EPA ratio. And these curves here represent 95% confidence limits, and these are the data points. A striking consistency that the further you reduce the levels of arachidonic acid, EPA, in the blood, the greater the improvement of the behavior. The good news is it takes only 30 days. The bad news is once the children stop taking the fish oil, all their behavior benefits dissipate within 30 days. And we can also see the effect of these omega-3 fatty acids on cerebral blood flow. If you have normal blood flow, the brain, and these are so-called SPECT scans, the blood flow is uniform throughout the brain, and you see nothing but a blue brain. But in children with ADHD, they have hot spots, where blood flow is hotter or colder. And you can see that, once you follow the zone diet with high-dose fish oil, you can see a dramatic improvement in the reduction of those hot spots, and with that improvement comes a great improvement in terms of behavior. One of the more interesting stories was really about 4 years ago that you may remember the Sago mine disaster, when 13 miners were trapped in the mine in the New Year's Day and were trapped there in a carbon monoxide atmosphere for some 41 hours. And when they broke through the mine, 12 of the miners were dead, and the one they brought out, Randy McCoy here, was virtually almost dead on arrival because he had heart failure, he had liver failure, he had kidney failure, and he had brain failure. Brain failure in that there was his MRI of his brain, and virtually no white matter was existing. So his likelihood of surviving was slim, and if he did survive, he'd probably end up being a vegetable. Well, that night I got a call from his neurosurgeon because the neurosurgeon had just gotten a call from the governor of West Virginia. And he said, do not let this man die. So he called me up and said, okay, I think fish oils are important, but how much should I give him? Well, we just finished our study with the kids with ADHD, where we're giving them 15 grams a day. I said, let's give him 15 grams a day. He said, my God, he'll bleed to death. I said, he won't bleed to death, trust me. So we started basically giving him 15 grams a day of omega-3 fatty acids through his breathing tube. And continued this for 2 months, and he came out of his coma. Continued feeding the omega-3 fatty acids at the same level for another 2 months, and he went home. And when he went home, his heart was normal, his kidney was normal, his liver was normal, and he gave a press conference worthy of any politician. So what do the investigative press of America say about this? They say it's a medical miracle. Well, it wasn't a miracle. It was simply aggressive use of high-dose fish oil as an anti-inflammatory agent to reduce the inflammation in the liver, the kidney, the heart, and the brain, and giving those organs a chance to basically heal. Now, this is Randy about 9 months later, and there's his wife, and there's Julian Bales, his neurosurgeon, and myself, and you can see his wife is pregnant. Since that time, they've had 2 healthy children, so everything seems to be working pretty well for Randy and his wife. And what's the greatest risk as we age? And it has to be basically development or developing Alzheimer's. And Alzheimer's does not happen overnight. But we do know that one marker of silent inflammation, C-reactive protein, that if you have high levels 25 years earlier, you are 300% more likely of developing dementia as you age. Why? Because we know that Alzheimer's is a neuroinflammatory disease. And that's why the clinical benefits of high-dose fish oil are incredibly robust, and you're seeing on a daily basis new data coming out confirming over and over and over again the benefits of fish oil, whether it be in heart disease, cancer, depression, attention deficit disorder, multiple sclerosis, brain trauma, Alzheimer's, chronic pain, osteoporosis, skin disorders, fertility, or even fat loss. How can one agent that seems to be so innocuous do so many things? Because it dilutes out excess arachidonic acid, and by doing so, it decreases the production of pro-inflammatory eicosanoids. But yet, there are different types of fish oil. We could say just eat fish. Well, we have a problem there because there's no fish in the world today that is not contaminated with things that we have thrown into the environment in the last 2 generations. Things like mercury, PCBs, dioxins, and flame retardants. Now, the Japanese are the biggest consumers of fish in the world today, but their blood levels of PCBs are near the upper limit set by the World Health Organization. Well, why not basically take out the fish oil from the fish? Well, unfortunately, all these toxins we talked about are fat soluble. So when you extract out the crude fish oil, you're also extracting out the crude toxins. And if I go to a health food store and buy fish oil capsules, what you're getting is basically the encapsulated sewer of the sea, rich in PCBs. So here you have the horns of a dilemma. How to get enough fish oil of the omega-3 fatty acids to dilute out excess arachidonic acid without taking in high levels of these toxins, which are known neurotoxins and carcinogens. The answer occurred about 10 years ago with the development of what are called ultra-refined EPA DHA concentrates. These are basically weapons-grade fish oil, highly refined to increase the levels of the omega-3 fatty acids, but in the process removing virtually all the toxins. And now these can be used in high-dose, long-term applications. And all those studies I talked about in the previous slide were those using this new type of ultra-refined EPA DHA concentrates. Now, what's the requirements for such a weapons-grade fish oil? Well, one, you have to have a lot of omega-3 fatty acids. You have to have very low levels of dioxanes measured in parts per trillion, low levels of mercury, and low levels of PCBs. Perhaps 1, maybe 2% of all the fish oils in the market today can meet these requirements. And the reason is because the more you refine a fish oil, the more costly it is. If you really want the cheapest fish oil, take cod liver oil. But unfortunately, cod liver oil is now the most contaminated fish oil on the market today because of the recent contamination of fish worldwide. When you go to a typical health food store or a supermarket and buy fish oil capsules, they aren't much better than the cod liver oil, but they're cheap. In fact, when you go to a health food store, the cost of the soft gelatin capsule is usually 10 times more than the fish oil inside the soft gelatin capsule. You can even buy fractionated fish oil. It has a little higher concentration, maybe 30, maybe 40% omega-3 fatty acids. It's a little more costly, but it is what it is. But eventually you get to what I call pharmaceutical grade, this weapons grade fish oil. It's more costly, but now basically it's weapons grade fish oil that you can use on a long-term basis at high dosages with confidence. Now, how do you know if your fish oil is pharmaceutical grade? There are 3 ways. The easiest way is what I call the toothpick test. If you have some fish oil capsules, that's good. Break open 4 or 5 of them and put them into a shot glass. Now put that shot glass into your freezer and come back 5 hours later with a toothpick. If you can't put the toothpick through the fish oil, which means it's frozen solid, what you've been taking is a sewer of the sea, and you can bet your bottom dollar, no further test required, it has a lot of PCBs in it. A more sophisticated way is go to a free website. It's called ifosprogram.com. The IFOS stands for International Fish Oil Standards Program. It's run by the University of Guelph, and there they will analyze fish oils with the most sophisticated instrumentation known today in the world, and basically post results. And you can now basically look at different fish oils being either 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, 4-star, 5-star, and basically find out basically what the real levels are. Now, very few fish oil manufacturers send their samples to IFOS because they know that if they send them, the results will be published for all to know. But surprisingly, probably the best way of tasting or testing fish oil is by smell and taste. That we have very, very highly sensitive mechanisms in terms of looking for smell and taste, especially for fish oils, that can pick out contaminants. It's like in terms of the fishy smell, it turns out there are certain aldehydes and ketones at the levels of parts per trillion, which basically account for the smells. Why should that be a concern to you? Because these aldehydes and ketones can cause breakage of DNA. And therefore, if you can smell a fish oil, basically it's a dangerous fish oil. And taste is also an excellent way. Many people pride themselves as being a connoisseur of wine, saying, this wine has a bouquet. Well, you want to become a connoisseur of fish oil. How do you do it? You bite into a fish oil capsule and say, this might have been anchovies, 2010. But again, if it has a very bland taste, then it's probably pretty good stuff. So again, you have three different ways of looking at fish oil purity. And the irony is that there is one drug sold in the market today that's a pharmaceutical for fish oil. But basically that drug has a terrible taste and a terrible smell. So it's ironic that there are a number of non-prescription fish oils products in the market today that are actually far more pure than the only fish oil that's approved as a drug by the FDA. Now, how much of these omega-3 fatty acids do you need? Well, if your goal is wellness, and that should be the goal, and you're not sick, you don't have any chronic disease, and you look okay in a swimsuit, means you're not overweight, you'll probably need that 2.5 grams a day, and that's the amount your parents got when your grandparents gave them a tablespoon of cod liver oil. But let's say you're more inflamed, you're obese, you have diabetes or heart disease. Plan to double the dosage. And what if you no longer have silent inflammation, but now you have screaming pain, like arthritic pain or the pain from cancer? Still higher levels. And what if your inflammation is inside the central nervous system? Still higher levels yet. Make no mistake about it, these are high levels. And as a consequence, they require high purity fish oil to basically keep those conditions under control. And the wild card is basically how much effort you're willing to control the levels of insulin. Remember from an earlier slide, it's excess insulin that drives the activation of the delta-5 desaturase enzyme that makes arachidonic acid. So by squeezing off omega-6 fatty acids diet and controlling and moderating insulin, you can basically now moderate the amount of arachidonic acid the body makes. Less arachidonic acid you make, the less inflamed you are. So the more you control insulin, the less omega-3 fatty acids you need to control inflammation. But the converse of that is also true. The less you control insulin, the more omega-3 fatty acids you need to control inflammation. The choice is purely yours. Use a diet and fish oils, you need less fish oils. Ignore the power of your diet, you'll need more fish oils to reduce the inflammation. And this ratio of arachidonic acid to EPA can change very rapidly. How rapidly? How about 30 days? Remember the studies we talked about before in terms of changing the composition of atherosclerotic plaques? That was basically 43 days. And the data we showed that in terms of prostate cancer, you could upregulate anti-angiogenic proteins. That was 45 days. Within 30 days, you can begin to change the inflammatory matrix of every cell in your body, simply by doing what? Taking adequate levels of fish oil. But the really fascinating thing of fish oil is its ability to modulate gene expression. We talk about genetics as the new breakthrough in medicine. It is. But in many ways, we can modify those genes and the expression of those genes by our food, and fish oil is a powerful tool to do that. And how it does that, it works at the level of the innate immune system. This is the most primitive part of our immune system that we share with plants. It hasn't changed over hundreds of millions of years of evolution. It was seen to be primitive because it works on pattern recognition, and it's very nonspecific. But from our standpoint, the key factor is it can be affected by the diet. And how it works is shown in this particular slide. A little complex perhaps, but here's the key factor, was nuclear factor kappa B. This is your master inflammatory switch. And if this is activated, then basically it now goes into the DNA and causes the expression of inflammatory hormones or inflammatory mediators. So the power of fish oil is to inhibit the activation of nuclear factor kappa B, and by doing so, silence the inflammatory process. So here's basically a simplified aspect. Arachidonic acid itself can directly activate nuclear factor kappa B, as can toll-like receptors, especially those that recognize saturated fats. This is the reason why you want to keep saturated fats in your diet to a minimum, because they can interact with toll-like receptors and send a signal to activate nuclear factor kappa B. And other things like cytokines, which are basically due to the production of silent information, can also activate this. So we have three dietary factors which can activate nuclear factor kappa B. And if activated, it goes into the DNA and out comes increased inflammatory enzymes like COX-2 or inflammatory cytokines like interleukin-1, interleukin-6, or tumor necrosis factor. But here's how you basically modulate this dietary system. For toll-like receptor 4, basically try to reduce the amount of saturated fats in your diet because they activate this. On the other hand, omega-3 fatty acids inactivate it. In terms of nuclear factor kappa B, it's activated by arachidonic acid. It's inhibited by omega-3 fatty acids. So you can see that from either toll-like receptors or nuclear factor kappa B itself, we have great control using simply the diet as a tool to regulate up or regulate down the levels of inflammation. And this is why, in many ways, fish oil may have been a key component of why our species, of the 30 million species on the face of the earth, eventually conquered the world. We're a fairly new species. We've only been around for some 200,000 years. But the best available data says what gave our ancestors that little blip allowed them to conquer the world. Basically, they blundered on the brain food about 200,000 years ago. What is that brain food? It turns out it was omega-3 fatty acids, because our earliest ancestors were really hanging on by their fingertips and were forced to basically find new food sources, which turned out to be one of the few areas left in Africa, which was basically shellfish. And those shellfish contained enough omega-3 fatty acids to basically dramatically begin to increase brain function. And it's these essential fatty acids, and omega-3 fatty acids are essential. Without them, the body does not work. But they control inflammation, and more importantly, they control neurological function. If the levels of omega-3 fatty acids decrease, you become more inflamed, or if the levels of omega-3 fatty acids decrease, your cognitive neurological function decreases correspondingly. And therefore, fish oil may be a key to our future. If our future is to control the acceleration of chronic diseases, or to control our emotions and cognitive behavior. So fish oil, we can now understand from an evolutionary standpoint, is a critical component in terms of our health in the future and as well as our cognition. So here's the summary. Why is fish oil important? It regulates eicosanoids. It helps you to dilute out arachidonic acid. And it also makes anti-inflammatory eicosanoids like resolvins. It regulates gene transcription. That's a powerful statement. Something that's been around for a long time. Fish oil can turn genes on and turn genes off, especially turning off the genes that cause inflammation. And the fish oil may have been a key to our past and why we evolved to be the dominant species on the planet, and it very well be the key to our future as a species. If we don't have adequate levels of fish oil in our diet, our body will not respond the way it should, and it basically has been driven by inflammation to respond under ideal conditions. So if you'd like to have more information about fish oil, and it's a complex area that's constantly changing, if you want to know more about the science, I'd suggest go to drsears.com, where I have, every month I go through all the literature in the world to try to bring together the latest breaking research in fish oils and diet and how they affect inflammation. And if there are products you'd like to find out about, especially fish oil products, then I'd recommend going to our other website, zonediet.com. And with that, I thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sears. I never cease to be amazed at the potential these omega-3s have for us and for our species in particular. One One of the questions that well, first of all, I'm going to have to say, folks, if you want to type in your questions, there is a chat box in the floating blue panel to the right of your screen, where it says questions, or I believe chat. You can type in your question, and you need to click on send to have us see it and ask and ask the questions for you. We're going to give you a couple of minutes to do that while I ask a couple of questions on my own, Dr. Sears, it seems like you focus primarily on the inflammatory ability of the fatty acids. Now, we know that the brain itself is composed of about 60% by weight is made up of fatty acids or fat. What percentage of the activity of the omega-3s is because of their brain building capacity as opposed to the inflammatory capacity?
Well, you're quite right. About 60% of the dry weight of the brain is fat, and of that, about 20% is omega-3 fatty acids. Now, one of the common misconceptions about brain function is saying if we look at a brain, we don't see any EPA in the brain. We see lots of DHA, so if we have neurological problems, let's just basically give lots of DHA. Well, it turns out that, we have to ask the question, why don't we find very much EPA in the brain? The DHA is a structural component, and basically once it gets in the brain, it stays there for a long time. The half-life is about 2.5 years. On the other hand, the EPA also gets in the brain, but its half-life is measured in days because it's rapidly oxidized to water and carbon dioxide. It's the EPA that has the anti-inflammatory actions, whereas the DHA has, basically structural components. So what we have to do as a species, we have to keep high levels in the bloodstream to make sure there's adequate levels of EPA in the brain to help now dilute out the arachidonic acid. So that's why saying people say, well, for the brain you use DHA and for the immune system you use EPA, misses the whole question. You need them both. They both do different things, and that's why you need to have them both delivered at the same time. But to control the inflammation in the brain that basically drives the neurological disease process, whether it be multiple sclerosis, depression, Parkinson's, or even Alzheimer's, you need to have constant high levels of EPA in the brain to basically keep the inflammation under control.
Okay, so when it comes to inflammation, we're talking about EPA, and when we're coming to when we talk about brain development and brain growth and growth of neurons, we're talking about DHA?
And structure. So think of the DHA as basically the bricks you need to make a brick house with.
Got it. Okay, great. Well, that helps to simplify it for me. Thank you. All right, we have a couple of questions coming in. Dr. Marvin is on the webinar. He says, "Tell Dr. Sears hello for me."
Oh, well, thank you very much. I tell him I apologize for our early, technological foul-up.
Sure thing. He would have hosted this webinar had it not been if he had known we were going to switch back to this, but this was a last-minute thing. Okay, Dr. Sears, wonderful webinar. I hope we are going to be able to purchase a copy, as there is so much to learn. I guess she's referring to your book, and that can be gotten from zoneliving.com, right? Right,
or Amazon.com, and again, I've written some 12 books, but the world of essential fatty acids keeps on evolving at a rapid rate. So I have lots of another probably 12 books to go before I call it a career.
Well, just keep us informed as you crank them out. Another nutrient that has gotten a lot of publicity so far also has been the vitamin D3, and someone is asking, what about using vitamin D3 along with omega-3s?
Well, I think vitamin D3 actually is a hormone, and that's why basically we understand a lot of its abilities. Now, the two are very synergistic, and this is at the level of what are called transcription factors, especially transcription factors known as PPARs. that vitamin D3 can basically activate one component of the PPARs, as can, and the fish oils activate another component. And when those two combine, they become very powerful agents to basically cause the expression of fat-burning enzymes, and also, which basically would lower triglyceride levels, and also other hormones and that basically have anti-inflammatory responses. So I think that basically taking vitamin D3 along with the fish oil makes an excellent 1-2 punch. Now, how much would I recommend? Probably about 2,000 to 5,000 IUs per day of vitamin D, and really vitamin D3. But at the same time, that's a fairly small amount of vitamin D. You'll need probably about 5 grams of the omega-3 fatty acids.
So 5 grams of omega-3 fatty acids for maintenance of health, and it goes up from there depending on what you're dealing with.
Right, but at the same time, adding, let's say, 5,000 IUs of vitamin D3 makes very, very good sense.
Okay. What is considered to be a high dose of omega-3 fish oils in order to counter the side effects of statins?
Well, I guess it depends on how many statins you're taking, how much statins you're taking, and how strong the statin is. The newest statin is called Crestor, and it's the most powerful of all the statins. And therefore, with statins like that, you probably need more. I think you're probably looking in the range of, I would recommend if you're taking a statin, take at least 2.5 grams of omega-3 fatty acids, if not 5.
For each tablet of each pill, or just?
Well, at the dosage you're taking. If you're taking a low-dose statin, then 2.5 grams should be more than sufficient. If you're taking a high-dose or high-potency statin, I'd go to the 5 grams.
Okay. Okay, my understanding was that 5 grams is just for maintenance, but when you're taking a statin, your body is having...
No, the maintenance would be 2.5 grams, but that's why if you're taking the statin, just to be on the safe side. Again, that frankly, if I had the choice, I'd only take the fish oil. I wouldn't take the statin at all.
Well, that's just you, right? Okay.
Call me crazy.
Makes a lot of sense. Okay, someone says, thank you so much for this presentation. This is excellent information for us laymen. We can understand what you are talking about, and I agree with that completely. Okay, obviously you get this question all the time. Krill oil, what about it?
Well, krill oil is talk about things which are tempest in a teapot. It's krill oil. Krill oil is not an oil at all. Krill oil is basically the membranes of krill shrimp, small shrimp that grow in the Antarctica. And because they're phospholipids, they can't be purified. And so they have really higher levels of toxins than purified fish oils. And more importantly, they're not very concentrated. So on an economic basis, you're paying an extraordinarily high price for the amount of omega-3 fatty acids, and they're not nearly as pure as this ultra-refined weapons-grade fish oil. You know, the amount of krill oil sold in the world today is maybe $15 million worth of products, and the amount of fish oil sold is closer to about $2 billion. So that tells you something about the size of the market. So this has been hyped all out of proportion relative to the importance of krill oil or krill phospholipids compared to ultra-purified fish oils.
Mm. And in terms of performance, ultra-purified fish oils beat krill oils hands down, right?
Well, I'm just waiting for one study to show with purified. We have hundreds of studies. Actually, there's now close to 10,000 studies, but hundreds of great studies with purified fish oils that show powerful benefits. Mm. If someone will show me a study that is equal to, but I've not seen any studies in the literature to support this thing, that krill oil is better. And they say, well, it gets in the bloodstream faster. That's true if you look at only the first 24 hours. The purified fish oils can kind of get hung up in the microvilli of the mucosa, but after 24 hours, they get released and then go into the bloodstream. But you're taking fish oils probably for the rest of your life, so you're reaching a steady state. So it doesn't matter whether it's krill oil or the fish oils, they both will basically reach a steady state in the blood, and that's what you're looking for.
Right. Right. Okay. Speaking about fat loss and weight issues, a doctor here says a local office was recently opened advertising using HCG for weight loss. Is this dangerous? It appears to me the high-dose fish oil is more sensible. Thanks.
Well, it is more sensible. The HCG is basically a way of basically increasing testosterone levels. And testosterone will basically cause you to lose weight. There's no question about it. That's why basically you look better in a swimsuit. But here's the big but. That testosterone is a growth hormone, and what it does, it causes the decrease in the lengths of the telomeres, that basically are the caps at the end of the DNA. And the faster you decrease the telomere linkages, basically you get to a certain level and the DNA can't turn over anymore. And this is a study in telomeres where last year's Nobel Prize in Medicine was awarded for understanding how these telomeres are so important for longevity. So if you want to live longer, which is everyone's goal, then you want to slow down telomere turnover. Growth factors like growth hormone, testosterone, and insulin speed up telomere degradation. But a study was published in JAMA a few months ago that showed that fish oils tend to slow it down.
That is amazing. That is amazing. I have never heard that before. Wow. Testosterone can speed up the turnover of telomeres?
And so will growth hormones. So when you hear people on anti-aging say, well, we'll just inject testosterone, or we'll inject, also growth hormone, yeah, you're going to get great benefits. You're going to build that muscle quickly, and you're going to lose fat, but you're not going to live as long as you otherwise could.
Huh.
But you're going to look great in your coffin.
Oh my gosh. Okay. How many grams in one capsule of Omega RX?
Well, one capsule of Omega RX, and that's the one we produce, contains 600 milligrams of omega-3 fatty acids. And the other 400 milligrams in a 1 gram capsule are just the other fatty acids that basically come along with the purification.
Okay, so there are other fatty acids. You're talking about 3, 6, and 9?
3, 6, and 9s, and so the ones that basically in the process are not, you go higher concentrations, but then the price per the omega-3 fatty acids begins to escalate exponentially.
Okay, okay. Okay, I'm trying to get this right. Did I understand him to say that if you get testosterone shots that it speeds up the turnover of tumors? No. Does that mean that they will be making tumors? No, that's not what you're saying, is it?
No. It's basically it's just the opposite. Tumors, come from uncontrolled growth, where basically their telomeres don't shorten. Where on the other hand, if you basically have growth hormones like testosterone, they shorten the telomeres, and basically turnover of the DNA stops.
Okay. Okay.
And this is known as a Hayflick limit, that you can take cells and put them into tissue culture, and they'll turn over about 50 times, and then they'll stop. And the reason is each time you turn over a cell, the telomeres get shorter and shorter and shorter, till eventually they say, okay, it's time to stop.
And is that when the cell dies?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. All right. Someone asked a question about L-arginine, and I know there has been research about that and helping to the nitric oxide pathway and cardiovascular health and all that. But someone says the word after L. Okay, how is taking L-arginine affected by adding high-level omega-3s?
Well, they're both synergistic. They work on different levels. The L-arginine is a great source of basically and is the primary substrate to make nitric oxide, which is a very powerful vasodilator. So again, this is why now arginine and fish oil work very, very well in combination.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, we've had a few people come talk about L-arginine and the research behind it, and that's pretty impressive as well.
Oh, and that's why this becomes really the golden age of nutrition. 70 years ago, the best way to get a Nobel Prize was to do nutritional research, and discover a new vitamin. Then it fell out of disfavor. Saying, well, vitamins don't mean anything. Now the newest discoveries are how to basically control genes, and we're now finding out with new breakthroughs in molecular biology, the foods we eat have a great impact on gene expression, and they can be used to silence genes, especially inflammatory genes, which basically elevates diet to the cutting edge of 21st century gene therapy with no side effects. All of a sudden, nutrition comes out of the backwater and becomes frontline in biotechnology.
Mm-hmm. And I like what you say about using nutrition as a weapon, as a drug. I mean, that is a concept that is very, very foreign to most sectors in medicine.
Well, it is, except if they go back and look at the beginnings of medicine 2,500 years ago, Hippocrates said, "Let food be your medicine, let medicine be your food." Now we say, "Let food be your medicine." It says you treat food like a drug. You take it at the right dosage at the right time. Whether it be drug or food, they both work, but you have to take it at the right dosage at the right time.
Right. Okay, well, I have one more question. The same doctor who asked about the testosterone, and he's saying, do you have any written material on the effects of testosterone versus HCG? And we are talking about exogenous testosterone, when you inject it or ingest it, as opposed to when the body itself makes testosterone. Or it doesn't make any difference? Do both kinds increase telomere turnover?
Yeah, they both will. If you inject the testosterone, there will be further metabolism because it's not the natural route. The HCG will basically increase the natural release of testosterone the old-fashioned way, through the pituitary. But once the testosterone's in the bloodstream, it's basically a growth factor and will basically increase telomere turnover.
Right. Okay, so do you have any written material on that this doctor can go to?
Well, I'd probably go to my website and do a search just for testosterone, or I could refer back to a book I wrote a decade ago called The Anti-Aging Zone.
Anti-Aging Zone. Okay. Was that your second book or your third book?
No, actually, that was my sixth book.
Okay. I'm way behind. Okay. What is HCG? Someone asked. That's human chorionic gonadotropin, right?
Well, you said first. It's a mouthful, but it's a human. I can't get it out there, but it interacts with the pituitary to cause the release of basically factors that can increase testosterone production in the testes.
Is it just testosterone, or does it increase the others?
No. It basically that will tend to increase testosterone production.
Got it. All right, Dr. Sears, again, we're very honored that you would take the time to do this, and I know you have had a very, very busy schedule. You've been traveling all over the place in Europe. You went on a cruise. I mean, you've been everywhere, and yet you were able to find time to do this for us. So we really, really appreciate this.
Oh, it's always my pleasure.
Thank you, and hopefully we'll be able to do some more in the future as well.
I look forward to the opportunity.
I appreciate it. Well, we're going to say end this here and say have a great night. And folks, thanks for joining us as well. God bless.